Hello,
Yes,
brother.
I'm
Yeah,
doing good. Doing good.
yeah. It's nice to be here. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing great. And you?
All right. So today you said we'll be talking about what is going on in Sudan with the clashes happening in
Exactly.
in Sudan.
Mm.
Yeah. So basically, I want to say a big welcome to everybody for those that are just joining. The conflict in Sudan. So our first part is let's look at what is going on. So the early hours of Saturday morning, we saw that there were some clashes in a military town called Merowe. It's very close to the
Yes,
capital.
I've seen a lot of videos about it. Yes,
Yeah.
and I know that I know that Savok, you are an expert when it comes to this whole Sudan story.
Yeah.
So yes, I know that you are an expert. So I know that you can give us full briefing. But before we even talk about the war, can you really tell us this whole Sudan conflict? What brought about this whole Sudan story?
Okay. It's good to have a background. Thank you so much, Timo Media. So
Yeah.
it's good to have a background on the country called Sudan. At the
Mm,
point, Sudan was the largest country bar none in terms of landmass in Africa. So it's good
mm,
to understand the geography and demography of Sudan. And as it
mm,
stands currently, Sudan is one of the four biggest countries in Africa in terms of population. So Sudan
mm,
was formerly part of Egypt. They were all under the British mandate. So after
mm.
independence, Sudan broke off and had their own independence. So if you follow the history of Egypt and Sudan, you also know that if you remember him, Sadat, Anwar al-Sadat, the former president of Egypt, his mom was from Sudan. So
Okay.
there are largely Arab tribes in the north, and in the south you have the African tribes. So there's a discrepancy between the northerners and the southerners. So in the north you have largely Arab tribes who are mostly Reziga people, Fulani, and Bedouins. Okay.
Okay.
Then in the south you have the African tribes. So we all know what led to the conflict. So it was a disagreement basically between the Arab north and the African tribes in the south. And it was over resources and some cultural differences. So what
Mm,
happened basically is that the conflict started in the you can even go as far back as the 60s. So the conflict lingered for over 30 years. So what happened is that there was an accord that was signed in Abuja in 2006 by the leader of the SLM. So there was the Sudanese Liberation Army and there was the Sudanese Liberation Movement. So after that accord was signed, then it gave the South some form of autonomy. Then conflict broke out in the West. And why I'm giving this background is because you will still see this story and how it affects the current conflict that is happening on the streets
yes,
in Sudan
yes, yes.
today.
Mm,
So I'll
okay.
run it quickly. So what happened was after the agreement was reached with the South Sudanese people because they wanted to break away, because most of the oil actually are in the south, and in between the north and south there's a region called Abyei, which is now co-administered by the north and the south. But the problem the south have is they don't have access to the ports. So the south also needs the north to transport the oil to the port through Port Sudan. Okay, so
Okay.
through Port Sudan, that is where they can sell the oil. So they share the oil process between the north and the south. So the Westerners now complain bitterly that they have been left out completely of the agreement. So they started fighting in the west, and that is the region
Mm,
called Darfur, and
mm,
which is the cross of the problem. So in Darfur is in Western Sudan, Darfur
mm.
and the region of Blue Nile and the Nuba Mountains. It's very close to the border with Chad. And if you look at the people around there, most of them are, they look alike, they are culturally similar. But there's also the presence of the Arab tribes in Western Sudan as well, because 90% of people in Western Sudan are Muslims. So you have the
Okay.
three main African tribes there, the four
Mm-hmm,
tribes, the Masalit and Zagawa. So these are the three
mm-hmm,
main tribes, African tribes, and most of them are farmers and hunters. So you also have the Arab tribes among them who are popularly known as the Rezigats. You also have the Fula people. You also have the Falata. There are so many Arab tribes among them, just like you
okay.
have, in the Sahel. So basically,
Mm,
what happened is that after the conflict started with the justice and equality movement and
mm,
the Sudanese liberation movement, because a part of it was in the West. So the government of Omar al-Bashir at that time, because he was the president, could not cope with what was going on because the country's army was stretched so much. with the conflict still in the south, with problems in the north, economic problems. So he now resorted to tribal politics and contacted the Arab tribes in the western part of Sudan to take up the fight and restore dignity back to the country, to stop the Westerners from breaking away. And that was the genesis of the problem. So if you hear of the Darfur crisis that started basically and that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people were killed, it was because it turned and took an ethnic dimension. So one of the major people that led the conflict with the Western Sudan, the Arab tribe, was called Musa Hilal. So Musa Hilal was a, from the Falata tribe. Then Mustafa Hamdan Dagolo, who is the man in question today, we're talking about the conflict in Sudan, was also, from the Arab tribe. So he was the main commander. Dagolo was, I think he was in his late 20s when, he led the mission in Western Sudan in the Darfur. So he was able to largely contain the pressure in the south. And this was a contract that he reached with Omar al-Bashir so that they can have, some form of, quid pro quo. And the agreement was that him and his boys, who were called the Janjaweed at that point. So the Janjaweed in Arab are like bandits. So they were, and if you look at the background of somebody like Dagolo, Dagolo is popularly known in Sudan today as Hemeti. So his nickname is Hemeti. So he was the one that led those movements. And because of that, in order to pay him back, because of his loyalty, Omar al-Bashir now decided to integrate his Janjaweed fighters into the Sudanese political system, like, a paramilitary within the armed forces. So that happened in 2017, because we know as a fact that by 2011, the southern part had already gotten their independence, and the conflict in the west have died down because there were some other agreements that were signed, and the justice and equality movement have come to terms with the Sudanese government. So
Wow.
he now
Okay.
moved. He now moved from Western Sudan
So,
to
guys,
Eastern.
I mean, guys, if you are watching us live, make sure to like the program, like it so that other people can also see it. So, if you are here, please do as well to like the video because the information that Savak is giving us here is beyond our reach. I mean, he's giving us some interesting facts here. Bro, continue.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So basically, so what happened is that because of what he had done earlier, they now promoted him through the ranks, and Omar al-Bashir brought him into the government because if you look at Sudan, Sudan have had a past of military coups, okay? And
Yeah.
it is not just the military. Sudan is a very complex political space. You also have the question of religion. Of course, most of them are Muslims, but there's the
Yeah.
hardcore right, which drives from the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, before I go into the religious dimension, this is
Yeah.
how Hemeti, who is popularly known as Hemeti, his name is Mustafa Hamdan Dagolo, came to Khartoum, which is the capital city. Now he came to the capital city because of the trust that Omar al-Bashir had for him. He brought him very close to him, to his cabinet. In fact, he made him one of the top commanders, and all his boys were being paid, but they no longer call them the Janjaweed. In fact, they don't like to be called the Janjaweed. So they now rebranded and call them the Rapid Support Forces. So it's a special paramilitary unit which Omar al-Bashir was using basically as a guard
Hmm.
against whatever might happen because it felt like a military coup might happen. If you
Okay.
remember the uprising with the bread price that went up in Sudan, people started protesting. But the idea of the protest, if you look at what happened, the Sudanese actually felt, the political class felt like it was the West, it was the US and America because of the sanctions and every other thing, brought that upon the Sudanese people. So Omar al-Bashir traveled to
Before you
UAE.
continue, how did the Blackhawks get? How did the Blackhawks get into Sudan? American Blackhawks. How did they come in?
So, so that's a very interesting question. So,
Yeah.
if you look at what is going on in Sudan, Sudan is a very important, aspect of international politics, particularly in Africa,
Mm,
because why the Americans are so interested is because number one, because of their exploits in Somalia and East Africa, particularly because Sudan is caught between East and North Africa, and apart
yeah.
from that, Osama bin Laden was a guest in Sudan at a certain point in time. So he had links to people like Hassan al-Turabi. So there's a problem. In fact, there's a suspicion against Sudan that Sudan, is behind some of the terrorist attacks that were happening, not just in North Africa, but that they were sponsoring terrorism. And that is why, American espionage and, surveillance started in the Sudan. In fact, if you look at the calls for Omar al-Bashir to be brought to the International Criminal Court, it has links to that. Okay, so if I may proceed, what now
Okay,
happened is that
continue.
by 2019, Omar al-Bashir was toppled from power. So a section within the military now conspired with the same rapid support forces who Omar al-Bashir has trusted. He trusted Hemeti and brought him. Now sponsored the coup that, in fact, carried out the coup that removed him from power. But they kept him under house arrest and refused to give him back to the International Criminal Court. So
Okay.
they had an agreement that they would not hand him over, but they removed him from power because the uprising and the whole problem it was causing the country. And remember, it wasn't just about Omar al-Bashir. The problem was the military class. The military controls almost everything about the economic sector in Sudan. In fact, Hemeti is one of the richest men in Sudan today because he controls most of the gold mines. And the
Mm.
military control, production sites, armaments, a lot of stuff. If you look at a city like Al Qadarif, which is very close to the border with Ethiopia, it's a very, it's just like Lagos or Accra. It's a place flowing with economic activities because of the lake. Yeah, because of the lake there. So, and a lot of people, and it's a military town. So it is one of the most, in fact, in East Africa and in the north, it's one of the finest cities. But that is a question for another day. So basically,
Okay.
what happened is that by that 2019, the military now formed a transition council because the international community wanted Sudan to hand over power to the civilian government. So the person that became the head of the transitional military council is Abdul Fattah al-Burhan. Abdul Fattah al-Burhan is the commander of the army. Then the
Mm.
second in command, who was the vice president or the second in command to the Transitional Military Council, became the same man, Hemeti. In fact, if the international community people come to Sudan, they
Mm.
might see Burhan, but the main power broker is Hemeti. So they will have to go and see Hemeti because they know that the rapid support forces are the real powers behind the scene controlling affairs in Sudan because Omar al-Bashir had given him a lot of power at that point in time. And what gave them that edge is not just what is happening in Sudan, it's international actors. And this is very important to the audience and to everybody listening. The
Exactly.
politics of Sudan have an international dimension to it. So apart from the tribal politics that is happening with the Arab tribes themselves who discriminate against each other, now the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia had always had dealings with Omar al-Bashir. So, and al-Bashir now introduced Hemeti to them. So they were dealing directly with him. In fact, some of his fighters were taken as mercenaries to fight in the war in Yemen. They are one of the best fighting force in Africa, the Janjaweed. So people recruit them, international
Are they
actors like,
mercenaries?
yes, they recruit
They
them,
are
just like,
mercenaries.
yes, like PMCs, they recruit them to fight. So what is now
Okay.
happening is that Borhan and Hemeti are now having a clash of interest because if you remember, after 2019, there was a coup in 2019 that removed Omar al-Bashir, like I said, and the idea was to have election in 2021. But shortly
Mm.
before the election, there was another coup again by the same people that removed the Transitional Military Council because the Transitional Council composed of other civilians that were part of it. So the idea was to hand over power to a civilian before the election, then conduct the election. So what they did was to topple their own regime and form another council. So the Transitional Supreme Council, as they call it, now, which is largely dominated by military people. So what they are doing now is that because the election was planned for this year again, they are now fighting because they could not agree on who should be the head of the chain of command. Because there are two parallel commands in Sudan as we speak today, one by Hemeti and one by Borhan. So the regular army led by Borhan and the rapid support forces by Hemeti. So this is where the problem comes from. And because of that, the lack of agreement in terms of what they should do and who should have be in control of the army before the election is what we are now seeing manifest on the street today. Then I'll allow you to. to ask another
Okay,
question.
okay. Just before you continue, just like you said, there are a lot of international bodies involved in, this whole Sudan conflict. You are right. I read just before we came live. I was reading one article on Slaviangrad, which states that, he, for over 30 years now, Sudan buy weapons from Iran, and I agree with you when you say that there are a lot of international bodies involved. So I agree with you. So now, what is happening today? Because we've seen a lot of articles, a lot of videos on social media across, on YouTube, Facebook, everywhere, all social media platforms. We see a lot of videos, um, you know, and everybody's talking about Sudan. So I want you to brief or talk about whatever is happening recently. Today, I think yesterday and today, a lot has happened in Sudan. So I want you to give us the current update.
All right. So it didn't just happen today, right? For over the past weeks and even months, there have been negotiations between the two army commanders. Like I said, there's a parallel order line of command that is going on. One,
Mm,
the regular army, and secondly is the rapid support forces, who are commanded by Hemeti. So Hemeti is his nickname. That's what everybody calls him. But his real name is Mustafa Hamdan Dagolo. He's one of the most popular man, in fact, in North Africa. They know him, people, international communities, and so on and so forth. But the main head of the army, of the Sudanese regular army, is Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. So because two of them are leading the transitional government, and there's a clash of interest. They've been able to manage this all along, with the help of international actors, like I said, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. But what is playing out on the street today? In fact, the conflict started full scale early hours of today morning, which is Saturday, in a city close to the capital Khartoum called Merowe. So it's a military base, it's a strategic military base there, which is controlled by the RSF. So the conflict started there today. The RSF said that they were attacked by the regular Sudanese armed forces.
yes,
So the
yes,
conflict now spread.
mm,
So the
all right.
conflict now spread to other cities like Al Qadarif, like the second largest city, which is Omdurman, and even in Port Sudan, we have heard that there are also clashes in Port Sudan. So these are different army formations that are not really coherent, are not getting order from the same chain of command, and that is the origin of the problem. So brokers, in fact, people have been trying to mediate between them so that they can have. This is a dead end at this point because what is going on is that they know that at a certain point in time, one person must be in charge. Two people cannot rule the same country, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there must be one person in charge. And why they have tried to play down this problem all along is because they felt like at a certain point they will hand over power to a civilian government. So what Hemeti is saying is that he wants the civilian government to be in charge of the control of the army. Why the
Mm,
Of course, that is not possible because in Sudan, in fact, since independence, the military has always been the main actors, and the political power brokers have been behind the scene. Okay, so the military has relied on the populace, number one, and they have also relied on religious groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. And I was going to discuss about that as well. Now, if you look at the army,
mm,
the regular army, right, there's a
mm.
hardcore within the army that has been infiltrated by the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, and if you remember, the early days of Omar al-Bashir, he had support from the Muslim Brotherhood. There was a lot of funding coming from Egypt and so on and so forth. At the point, they wanted to go to war with Egypt because the military government in Egypt at that point felt that the Sudanese uh, regime was undermining it because it was shielding the Muslim Brotherhood, who was causing problem. In fact, if you look at the death of Anwar el-Sadat in Egypt, it was the Muslim Brotherhood that killed him because he signed the Camp David Accord with Israel. So the problem of the Muslim Brotherhood has been going on for a while in that part of the world, in fact, in the Middle East and in North Africa. So that is the challenge. So what Hemeti is saying is that it is the right-wing element within the army that is pushing so hard to kick them out of power, and that they are ready to fight till the very end because at this point, except it will take, like the international actors, like I said, Saudi Arabia and UAE, that is funding, because Sudan is cash strapped now. There's a lot of economic problems. So most of the fund they are getting from these countries that donate to them, like Saudi Arabia and UAE. So the roles of these two countries are very important, in coming to in bringing these two parties together. So it is just a clash of interest between Hemeti and Borhan that is leading to these
Okay.
clashes.
Oh, okay. 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 So does Saudi Arabia have some special interest? Why they happen? Do they have some special interest?
Uh,
Look
yeah,
at the country
that's
like
a very,
Saudi.
yes, that's a
Because
very good.
yeah, we see the Saudis and Iran are not getting along, and they are now supporting Sudan. Does MBS have any special interest?
Mm, yes, that's a very important question. Like I told you, remember that
Mm,
Mohammed bin Salman is not just about the relationship between Sudan and Saudi Arabia. It's not just about Mohammed bin Salman. The
mm,
relationship has been there for a very long time. In fact, people like Hassan al-Turabi, most of the top Muslim scholars, people look at Saudi Arabia as the cradle of Islam and the foundation of Islam and so on and so forth. But the ideology of Islam, most of the top religious scholars actually came from Africa, from Egypt, and from the Sudan.
mm.
So most of
Sudan,
them
yes.
even went to Saudi to teach them. Some Saudis came to Sudan to learn the
Mm.
Quran. Some of them, and because if you look at within Islam, which is another topic if we can discuss, there are
Another day,
five
yeah.
schools of thought within Islam. Okay, and the Hanafi and Hanbali. These are the two major. These are two of the five major schools of thought, or fikr madhab, as they call them. So the heart of it of this learning is in Sudan, but exported to Saudi Arabia. So they have some cultural affinities. And if you
Okay.
also remember that during the war in Afghanistan, the Saudis
Mm.
were funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. A lot of people from Sudan and Egypt actually left Africa to Afghanistan to fight at the behest of Saudi Arabia. And it is because of that relationship that Osama bin Laden was able to go to Sudan and stay there until the whole 9/11 attack happened and he had to leave. That actually strained relations between them and Sudan. But we have also seen, because it was just a temporary problem that they had, but they've had a long history. So in
Mm.
present time, Mohammed bin Salman have a war going on in Yemen, right?
Mm.
And who can he depend on? His allies. Now the Yemenis, the Egyptians, the Sudanese, all of them, they have a lot in common in terms of, they have so many Arab tribes, they have Bedouins, the terrain they have is similar, so then they understand each other very well. And like I said, the Janjaweed, who Hemeti commands, are some of the best fighting forces in North Africa. So Mohammed bin Salman has been able to recruit over 5 to 10,000 of those fighters. That is the rough estimate that we are hearing, to help him in his ongoing campaign in Yemen. So that is where the relationship comes from. And that is why not just the Saudis, but the Emiratis, because the Emiratis are also involved in the war in Yemen. So that is where the
Okay.
relationship comes from.
Okay. 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 Good. 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 But just to mention about the mercenary groups, I know the other day you were talking about mercenaries. You see, you've explained everything into detail, so I think everybody here now understand what is happening. But just to add a little bit to this whole mercenary groups, I remember the other day on TikTok, you said the mercenary groups, they are good fighters. They are far better than the regular,
Mhm.
fighters. And can you explain that again for the sake of our audience who are not part of our TikTok live?
Yeah,
I'll be glad to explain that. Yeah.
look at history. History has always told us it's not, like you need the state to have a constabulary, the armed forces, right? The armed forces are there to make sure that everybody is safe. But when it comes to war, the art of war is complete science of its own. So it's very easy for you to bomb from the sky, but you need boots on the ground. And when you need boots on the ground, there are so many dimensions, right? The
Mm,
motivation, the ideology, the knowledge of the terrain. There are so many factors that are put in place. So I'll give you an instance. If you
mm,
pick a regular soldier, so I'll use Nigeria as a case study. If you pick a regular soldier from the south, which is largely grassland, to northern part of Nigeria to fight, they are going to struggle because of the terrain. They get dehydrated, they cannot do that. So the locals are there, so they understand the terrain very well, and they understand the people that they are dealing with. So we have a problem in Nigeria, for instance, which is the Boko Haram problem. The soldiers are there, they are softening the ground, but the people that do the real fighting, just like what Wagner is doing
That's what I'm doing.
yes,
Okay.
just like what they are doing. They are the vigilantes. The local vigilantes understand the terrain very well, and so they are the ones that the regular soldiers are using. The regular soldiers, of course, they want to fight and die for their nation, but not all of them. They don't have the same motivation. They want to go back and see their wives and their children, right? But the mercenary is paid, he's ready. They are fighting to die. They are not.
You trust
So
me,
that is the
yes.
mentality they come with. They fight
Mm,
because they of ideological reasons, because of money. So nobody
mm,
accounts for them, and they are very ruthless. So it's the
mm,
same thing I said with not just. And if you go back in history, like I said, there are tens of thousands of names we can mention. In fact, in the war in Angola, right, when the South
mm.
Africa apartheid regime were struggling, they resorted to mercenary groups. They were using them to fight because the soldiers were running from
In
the
South
battlefield.
Africa, missionaries also fought in apartheid during the apartheid era.
Yes, the mercenaries. In fact, if you look at
Really?
yes, modern mercenary war in Africa, it actually started in South Africa. So I want you to
Oh,
look at the history. So
I,
it's
I,
very, very
I just learned that. I mean, I never, I never knew that. I never knew, during the
yes.
apartheid, we
Mhm.
had missionaries
Yeah,
fighting in
because I've heard you talk about I'll talk about the conflict in Angola, the liberation war, and
yeah,
what happened with UNITA and the what do you call is it MNLA? Yes.
yes,
So the MNLA and UNITA. So during that conflict, if you which is a diversion by the way, but the
yes.
mercenaries are very good fighters in terms because of their motivation, because of their ideology, and because of money. And that is why you see countries are now relying on them more now than the
We
regular
can even
soldiers.
see we can even see it in Ukraine. We can see that if you look at the Wagner, they are ruthless. They are taking the lead. We can see that progression, taking the lead everywhere you pass. The Wagner group is topping the chart. So
Yeah.
you are right. In fact, maybe
Mhm.
if you doubt what Savak is saying, look at what is happening in Ukraine, and the evidence is there for you to see.
Mm.
I agree with you on that. I agree with you. If you have
Yeah,
any question to ask about, you can ask.
in
But
the
before
comment
that,
section. Yes. So
yeah.
Timo, you mentioned Wagner, and what the international media will make us believe, which of course is true. Everybody can see what Wagner is doing. Is that it's the Wagner is a mercenary, they are non-state actors, but there are
Mm.
more foreign mercenaries on the soil of Ukraine fighting on behalf of Ukraine than they are on the Russian side. There's
Yes,
a group
yes, yes.
called
The
Mossad.
other day, I'm coming. The other day, you said the biggest mercenary group in
It's
Ukraine is not
Mossad.
Wagner.
No,
It's
it's not.
Moza. It's
Yes,
not
it's
Wagner.
Mossad, and it's a
But
coalition of foreign fighters.
they demonized Wagner. They claim that the Wagner group is the bad guys here. They are the evil guys.
Mhm.
Uh,
That is
so,
what they will make you to believe. But the West
uh,
are relying more on those mercenaries to do their fighting for them.
mm,
Even in Niger, you have foreign troops, US
mm,
soldiers that serve as adjunct. But what they use largely are Bedouin mercenaries to help them do the fighting. The reason for that is uranium. And that is why you're seeing the tension between France and the United States today. It's just about resources in Africa. It's about the
mm,
Sahel. France is
yeah.
controlling the Sahel. They are losing control of the Sahel. They are not happy about it. And the Americans want to replace them. So that is why you are seeing, even though they are partners, you're seeing the tension, the rivalry between them is growing and growing.
Mm, 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 mm.
Yeah, so if there's any question in the comments, you can drop questions in the comment and myself and
Really?
Timo. So we just want to have a 30-minute section on this topic. And
Yeah.
if you guys, if as there are new developments on the battlefield or
Yeah.
what is going on in Sudan, we would also keep in touch and do that again tomorrow. In fact, we should do this more often than not.
Exactly. We are planning that if we could, then every day self we can
Every
give
day,
up.
yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
You have
guys, if you are here, just follow me, follow Savak. All the time we'll be giving you updates on this whole war thing. So if you love war, if you love whatever is happening, war updates. Not, let me not say war, but if you love war updates,
international. Yes,
of course,
on international stage, international relations,
exactly,
international affairs.
exactly, exactly, exactly. So if you have any question, you can ask us. Um, Vladimir Putin is here. You're welcome. I can see
Yeah. And
Stephen. Can see.
Antimo,
Mm,
Antimo, this part is very important. Before we
yeah.
go, like you asked me a question in relations to Darfur before, so let me put
Yeah.
this so that the audience can understand very well.
Yeah.
Darfur is a region in Sudan, in
Mm.
western part of Sudan.
Yeah.
And the conflict that happened there, because people have been hearing of Darfur and Darfur and Darfur, and they just don't know anything about it. So
Yeah.
what happened was the conflict between the African tribes and the Arab tribes. So the main African tribes, three of them, the four tribe, Darfur. If you the name Darfur in Arabic is land of the four, because Dar in Arabic is land. So Darfur, then there is the Masalit tribe and the Zagawa. These are the three main tribes in the Darfur. And like I said, there are other Arab tribes, and these two tribes have been living together for over a millennia, for over 1,000 years. So, like the native African population, which are the three main tribes I mentioned, are mostly sedentary farmers and hunters, and the Arab tribes are camel herders and you know and hunters as well. So they have been living together for half a millennia, and this is also similar to what is going on in almost all the part of the Sahel and North Africa, because you have the African population on one
Mm.
hand and you have the Arab tribes, and there's a conflict. In fact, tension is there's tension that is growing, and it's tipping off the scale between these two groups over the past 20-30 years because of the lack of resources, or because of the scarce resources, right? Because of scarce resources, we're now seeing conflict between these two groups. Okay, I think Timo froze. Are you there, Timo? Is it my battery? So that is what is going on, guys. It's a tension, and the significance of what we are saying is that the two main power brokers in the north, who are Arabs, by the way, or of Arab origin, because even within the Arab tribes, you have different groups. They speak different dialects. They have their different. They have similar cultures, but not really the same. So that is exactly what is going on in Sudan. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining. Timo is frozen, so